You are listening to the Be a Better Being podcast, hosted by the founder of Better Beings, Michelle Zellner. Michelle's experiences have equipped her with knowledge and perspective, and for nearly 3 decades, she has been informing, influencing, and inspiring thousands on their journeys. This show spotlights guests of diverse backgrounds and areas of expertise, but they all align with Michelle's purpose and passion to help you be a better human being. There is something for everyone on their way to a healthier, happier life. Enjoy the show.
Greetings. Thank you for tuning into the Be a Better Being podcast. This is year 4, episode 129. It is January. It is cold and gray and snowy here in Denver anyway, but I'm pretty sure my guest is going to brighten the day. Adam Reiber is an Army vet and post-service went into the corporate world, eventually finding his way to employee well-being. And I'm really excited for this conversation because I know there's so much more to him that we're all going to learn together. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you and I connected over LinkedIn, I think late November-ish, and I took a screenshot of a post of yours. I thought, this guy's got a story, and I would love to have him on the podcast. And you said yes, and here we are. So thank you. Let's just start kind of at the beginning. I like the guests to introduce who they are, little background, where you grew up, what your life was like, what led you to the Army, and all the things, and then we'll get to talking about what you're doing today.
My life in a nutshell. I was born and raised in Long Island, New York, and like most, I think, Northeastern families, relocated to South Florida in high school. So I did 1 year, my senior year in Florida, and I joined the military. I was a 1.8 GPA. Coming out of high school. So there weren't many options for me. I think I tried like a semester of community college and I was like, what? Like, they don't care if I show up. And then, was not mature, was not ready. So I actually joined the Army right out of high school, maybe 6 months out of high school. And that's kind of where I found my footing. So I actually did a 20-year career and retired out of the Army. And when I first joined, I had no idea I was going to stay that long. Toward the end of my career, I got into leadership development. So it was all about like human behavior change. So I was an ROTC instructor. That's getting college kids ready to join the Army as an officer. So that was my last assignment. So that's really what got my engine running for behavior change. I'll back up though. I think what ultimately led me to the path of well-being was during my service, I had 4+1 near-death experiences. And I say +1 because my last assignment was at Boston University and it was for the Boston Marathon and I had cadets that were participating in it. So I was in and around the finish line when the bombing happened in 2013. It wasn't a near death. That's why I call it +1. It was just a good reminder that we shouldn't spend a single second of our day not enjoying what we do. If you're going through life and you're just miserable and you're not liking your job, and I think all that is in your control and you can change it. So my 4 near-death experiences was everything from a parachute malfunction as a teenager to I deployed 3 times, 2 to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, and had roadside bombs, small arms fire, and indirect fire. That rounds out the other 3. My first job as an adult was Microsoft. So I had an IT background in the Army. I enlisted infantry, and then halfway through I commissioned as an officer and went what they call Signal Corps, which is basically IT. And that's kind of what got my foot in the door in Microsoft was my IT background. But immediately when I got into Microsoft, I realized that everything we were doing in the military, leadership development wise, could be used. I thought that we were really good at it. And I thought the corporate world could benefit from some of the things that we did. So I was hired as an IT professional, but I immediately started doing leadership development stuff and it really took hold. And during my path of leadership development, I stumbled on positive psychology. I was reading about it and I thought I discovered it. And I was like, hey, I loved psychology. Like, why do people make the decisions and choose my undergrad is in economics, which is choices made in the face of scarcity. So I was kind of like scratching the surface with that, not really knowing where it was going to end up. And like I said, I thought I discovered it, but it turns out it's been around since Aristotle, quite some time. So what makes the good life thriving? He coined the term or eudaimonia. We can get into that later. But so I got into corporate learning and development in Microsoft. I built a well-being program within Microsoft, and this was during COVID. Like, it was much needed at that time. So they were like, eating it up. So as I was doing my master's in applied positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, I was implementing our assignments essentially into corporate Microsoft like immediately. And it was just good timing, 2020. This is 2019, 2020. So then fast forward, I took a job doing it for lawyers because I thought that would be super challenging. I thought there would be three challenging fields to do positive psychology: the military, lawyers, and probably doctors in the medical profession. So I took that challenge, did it for about 2 years, realized that is a feat that may be too big, because I think the industry itself is what needs some tweaking, not so much the Band-Aids that we can place. That's me in a nutshell.
Well, that's a lot. And I want to go all the way back to one thing you said, my first adult job. I mean, you're an adult in the military, right? Yeah. So I get it, but thank you for your service. I always appreciate anybody who is, especially a career like yours. So I can only imagine like all the experiences, all the things you learned, the skills, right? We're going to talk about mental toughness and resilience and all these things that you do learn very quickly in a situation like yours, and how those are so critical for anybody to be a healthy, happy human. And I think those are things that aren't taught. They're just, you either take the opportunity to learn and build them or you don't. And I think the work that you're doing now, similar to what I do, is helping people realize that these are skills that you develop along the way, but there is no rule book for it, right? Usually we have an experience, we either learn from it or we don't, and we just kind of go on from there. So let's go back even a little further, because obviously you eventually went to college, even with that 1.8 GPA from high school. Yay. So tell a little bit about, by then I'm guessing you're, an older student, or did you do college while you were in the Army?
No, I did it while I was in the Army. I did undergrad while I was in the Army. They had a really good program. This was like early 2000s where they did it. They rolled out this program called eArmyU. So they passed out laptops to soldiers and allowed them to do online distance learning courses while they served. So I initially started doing that, but then you get to a certain amount of credit hours, and then I applied for OCS, which is Officer Candidate School. I was accepted into that. And then during that program, they did a thing called degree completion, where they gave you time to go full time to go finish your degree. So I was able to do that at North Carolina. And yes, I was a little bit older. The time was right. I was never a dumb kid. I just didn't have direction. Like, my parents didn't check homework, didn't do, all the things that I do today. So I was a little older and just realized that school is important, and just I had actually a great time when I attended. I was probably 24, 25, somewhere around there. So it's a little bit more mature of a student. I don't think I would have made it if obviously if I came right out of high school. I needed that.
And I think that's a really important message for today's world, because there's always such a push, right? Everybody's got to go to college, go to college, go to college. And no offense, this, boys mature a little later, right? And so the timeline, just because this is the age you graduate high school and you're supposed to go to college, for many, it really isn't a good fit at all.
Yeah.
Obviously with the GPA, I'm sure that was something that prevented you from even being able to go, but your family norms, because I know in my family, that was the thing, you're going to go to college. And it wasn't even a thought that you weren't going to go. So just upbringing, it sounds like you had a little bit of a feral childhood, which is fun. Yeah. But what molded and shaped you growing up that even thought about, anything of your future? What was that dynamic like?
I think not having a lot growing up. I think today, even though average median income is pretty steady state, we don't want for anything for the most part. I think anyone can have anything they want. There's, finance options and things like that. But I don't think that was the case with my childhood growing up. I was one of five, and if food came in the house, like, like you had to eat it, it just wouldn't last. So I think just battling through that, again, not having the best childhood. It's interesting because later on in my military career, I had this is on my exit, I had this interview for PTSD, and I was like, I don't have PTSD. I'm gonna walk into this interview and I'm gonna smoke it. And it was like very first questions that were asked were, tell me about your childhood. And I was like, oh, like we're going back this far. So that was kind of like an eye opener for me, because I was raised in a not so good environment when my father was abusive, like physically, to the five of us. And then that kind of like ended when I was 14. My parents ended up getting divorced. I went to live with my aunt and uncle, and I found like a positive male role model in my uncle, then getting into athletics and things like that. But it wasn't until I was, a sophomore in high school. You ever pick up a sport, by the time you're a sophomore in high school, there's likelihood you're probably not going to make any team. I mean, these kids, even like today, they're starting, super early. I wasn't like super good where I made teams, but I was starting to get my footing. And it wasn't like I said until I joined the Army, where I was like, I got the first sense of like real positive affirmation. I was always a good runner. Like, as far as like runners are concerned, like I'm not a good runner, but when I went into the military, I was like a phenomenal runner. There's a big difference. So like, it was like, hey, you're good at this. You're good at this. And I was like, oh, I like this. I like this feeling. And then it kind of like just snowballed from there. I started to do challenging, more, harder things, and I was accomplishing them. And, so the military was like just really good at giving me that like positive affirmation to kind of keep going. I don't know what I would be without it, to be honest. Well, I don't, I think about it sometimes, and I'm like, I don't know what I would have ended up doing. Definitely would have went to college, right? Like,
yeah, well, I think it reinforces how important positive role models, and especially for boys, right? Like, we have a boy crisis now, and it's for all the reasons that you talk about. And I think, you can still, even in the military, you can not have the right sergeant, the right commander, right? It can still go wrong. It just depends who that specific person, that positive influence in your life is, and that you're willing and open to receive that. Because I know even, we talk about childhood traumas, you're used to a certain kind of way. So now you get something positive. Maybe you kind of resist it, don't trust it, don't believe it, put up all the guards, right? All the things. And so maybe it wouldn't have that kind of impact. So what was it about that experience that made you be like, oh, I am good at something, like somebody's telling me and I actually believe it? Because I think that's the thing, right? Is that unless you actually believe it, it doesn't matter if somebody tells you.
I could tell you a specific story. It was like just very early on in basic training. I was made the platoon guide, which is like in charge of the 30 people in your platoon. I don't know how that happened. Like, I don't, but I was, when I was put in that role, I stood in that role the entire time in basic training, which is very uncommon. I don't know why. There was one day where I lost it because I had to climb a rope and I couldn't like climb it because I didn't know like a technique. I was like strong arming my upper body, not knowing you had to lock your legs, to get up this thing. So like I didn't make it up this rope and I got fired. So that night I snuck out with a friend and climbed the rope. And I went back and I told my drill sergeant, which was probably a mistake in the sense that like they called it smoked, where you got to do push-ups and things like that. This was back in like the late 90s, a lot different probably than it is today. But I was put back in my position. And I think like that was my first test of, hey, I faced some adversity, but I was able to overcome it. And I got like a positive reward for it. Like it was a good thing. Like I took a risk to go out and do that. But that kind of like set the tone for my entire military career, because I did a lot of things very early and very young. I was 19 years old leading a team of, 5 people. This wasn't like combat operations yet. This was still the late 90s. I was the first private first class to graduate Ranger School in the 82nd Airborne in like 20 years or something like that. Like they stopped sending PFCs, they call them PFCs, the rank, to Ranger School because they kept failing and they weren't doing well. And only one unit could send privates to Ranger School, which was the Ranger Regiment. So like I had all of these like benchmarks where I was getting this positive affirmation. I was getting like an opportunity to excel, and I would I would like achieve it. So then it just became like, hey, and I felt this like in the military, I felt there was nothing that I couldn't do. So I think just like battling out of that adversity from childhood, transitioning in, getting good positive affirmation, finding good male role models because I didn't have it early. And I always wonder, like, could I have been like good at something? Like I'm a big basketball fan. So I think that that's very important. It's kind of like where I think my next chapter of life, I would love to like, be a role model to young kids who are like me, who maybe don't have like that many options, who just need a little, kick in the butt to get started. Cause I think they're out there, right? And they're a little bit lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think also you highlight the importance of like community and connection and team, right? Because all of those obviously really critical in the military, and we're not supposed to do life alone and try to figure it out. And yet, given, the childhood that you had, I imagine you often felt like you were just left to fend for yourself.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
And these things all translate like totally parallel into the workplace, right? Into the corporate world. So 20-year career and then finding yourself in corporate world, I imagine that was quite different, right? Because it's not that teamwork, it's not that regimen, it's not that complete structure that you're used to having. Yeah. So what was that adjustment like?
It's good. It's challenging. I was bred to move fast. Like in the military, you move fast. You have an 80% solution. Like they say, like a timely 80% solution is better than a 100% solution that's late. So everything I did was like just super fast, and it was not like so much resistance in the corporate world. Like you just can't do that. There's a million reasons why, and I really had to adjust. I came in and I helped this HR group. I was doing leadership development at the time for the data centers, the cloud of Microsoft. And I started helping with like global HR programs. And you can imagine like it was just a little different. Like they are very, meticulous in the way they do things. And I came in and I was like, let's go, let's do this, this, and this. And it was like, hey, just pump the brakes, slow down. I'm like, okay. Two other things I think was like stress. I felt zero stress. And I think that this goes back on your experiences of doing hard things. The harder things you do, it makes the, future projects seem just, it's like you can handle it, right? You're building self-efficacy when you do hard things. So then when the other things come up in the future, you're like, oh, I've done X, Y, Z, like this is going to be a piece of cake. So I never really had stress with anything. I still don't with like in the corporate world. Like if the TPS report isn't on time, like does anybody die? Does anything blow up? Like, no, like we'll be okay. Half the deadlines in corporate are self-imposed, right? So, what was the other thing?
I don't know, but I want to circle back because one of my litmus tests is, did anybody cry and did anybody die?
Yeah.
The answer is no to both of those. It's like, okay.
We always said in the military, life, limb, or eyesight. Like, if none of those things happen, like it's all going to be good, Well,
and I think that's why your background brings such a unique perspective and skill set to the corporate world, because, you know what you know, you do what you do, and people who haven't served in a way that you have, there's no way you can even imagine the things that you've been through, and seeing people that you care about, that you step alongside with, right, get injured and die and all the things, and you yourself being that close a number of times. And I think unless you've lived that, you have absolutely no way of really appreciating what that's like. And so then, you see these things that people are stressing out about, and you're like, no, it's not to dismiss or diminish their experience, right? But I do think a little bit of perspective anytime can be helpful, as long as somebody is willing to receive that perspective. So as you are stepping into like this well-being role, and it was kind of new, so I've been doing sort of what you do for about 10 years now, but definitely COVID like amplified it. And all of a sudden everybody needs a well-being program. It's like, wow, hey, good idea.
That was very short-lived though.
In some ways, but I do think it's opened up the conversation. I'm going to say, especially with men talking about it. I've been doing this for a long time, and I will tell you, there are way more men coming to well-being trainings than ever before. And I do think that's because of COVID and, people being more open and talking about it and talking about the mental health crisis. And, for men and military vets specifically, like the highest rates of all of those things. And since I just brought that up, I do want to circle back to your post-exit talking about PTSD. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And my guess is the answer was, oh yeah, actually I do. So then what? So what did your own mental health look like? And what did you do to maybe support it, get it to a better place?
So ironically, I was clinically diagnosed with it. I don't believe I have it. I actually believe I have post-traumatic growth, which is the other side of it. I walk around in awe of things. Like, I moved out to Cheyenne, Wyoming to get closer to nature, to be out. Like, I need to go out into nature, and I'm always in awe of seeing the mountains and, when you have snow cover, things like that. So maybe I'm in denial. I don't have any of the classic like symptoms. Like, I don't have nightmares. I don't have terrors. Like, if a loud thing happens, not I'm going to say bomb, because that doesn't happen very often. A loud noise, backfire of a car. Like, I'm not like jumping under, there's the stereotypes of like what it may look like, and I think it's portrayed a lot in Hollywood, but like, I don't get night sweats and terrors and things like that. So like I said, maybe I'm in denial, but I think I'm more like post-traumatic growth, where like, and this is kind of, I think, what led me to positive psychology in the first place was like, like I was talking about, I always was enamored with why people made the choices they did, but I never was really interested in learning about the clinical side of psychology, the PTSD, the schizophrenia, the depression, clinical anxiety, things like that. And I was always like, what's the other side? Kind of what got me into it initially was there was this traumatic event that happened to my unit, and my friend and myself, like we both went through the same, where we lost somebody. And he kept asking himself like why it wasn't me, and blaming himself. Whereas I was like, I'm lucky to be here. I'm going to take advantage of all these opportunities. So long story short, my friend actually committed suicide years later. But I think like that was the moment in time where things started spiraling down, where he started getting into alcohol, and that led to hard drug. And this is like while in the military, so it's like not good. Then he got like kicked out, and then he started gambling, and it just stacked on top of each other, and then ended up, I think it was around 2020. So this is like 8-10 years later that it ended up happening. So I was always interested, like, hey, the same traumatic event happened, and some people end up coming out of it better, and some people they can't recover. And I was always like, hey, like, what is this thing? How causes that? And I think that's initially like what got me into like positive psychology and like resilience and things like that. Cause my capstone was 86 pages of goodness. I think only like one other person has read, you do this thing and you put it on the shelf and it collects dust. But it was about psychological capital. So it's HERO, hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism, and how we can build that. And I think like if organizations like focused on, because those are both psychological traits and states, right? You're born with an inherent amount, but then you can also get better at it. So I am really intrigued with the resilience part of it, and I think it's because of my life experiences.
Can you repeat that, HERO? Repeat what it is, because it's fantastic.
Hope, efficacy, like self-efficacy, resilience, and optimism. Efficacy is important. And this is why we talk about doing hard things. I think there's recently read the book Comfort Crisis. I forget the author's name, but it was like, hey, once a year, like schedule something and do a really hard thing. And that builds like we're talking about self-efficacy. So then if you have a report due or a project due at work, you'd be like, well, I, swam the English Channel last year. Like, this is nothing. Yeah, but I think this is another reason why corporate well-being kind of fizzled a little bit, because they tagged somebody from HR to do it instead of hiring and bringing in professionals that know what they're doing, right? So they came in and they led with meditation, or they removed salt from the cafeteria tables, or took all the soda out of the vending machines. And then we're sitting here twiddling our thumbs wondering why, like, we still are having like, record high short-term disability leaves and things like that. I just think because we're not doing it right.
Yeah. And I think that's like culturally, we've been in a time of safe spaces and everybody gets a blue ribbon. So I'm a Gen Xer. We didn't grow up that way. Like, rub some dirt on it, figure it out. You lost, big deal. Try harder next time. No, you're not getting a medal for that. No, you have to earn your things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is such a foreign thing to me, where everybody gets a trophy. And whenever that happened, I'm sure it was, Gen X kids, having kids and like, oh, we want to protect our kids at all costs. Well, that means they never have a challenge, which means they have no idea what to do when they actually have one.
You're right.
Right? Because we're going to swoop in and protect them and not let them get a boo-boo or a scrape or make a mistake. And yet those are all the things that build your resilience, right? And so to your point, like, I can deliberately challenge myself, or sometimes life presents a challenge to me. And then I can either have mental toughness and learn and grow through it, or I can crumble up in a ball and turn to alcohol and turn to drugs and turn to isolation. And those are the things that are going to lead to the outcome. So I feel like there's a shift maybe in the last year or two, kind of going back towards, toughen up, buttercup kind of mentality. I think the pendulum always swings, and I feel like we're starting to swing back. So as you are developing this well-being in the workplace, I mean, I know when I started, it was bring fruit in on Wednesdays, have massages come in once a month. We'll reimburse you for your gym membership. That's our wellness program, right? So when you're designing a well-being in the workplace, like, what does that look like? So, because you're like an in-house on-site versus me, I'm like the one-off girl, or maybe I see this group every month or a couple times a year. So I'm not in-house on-site for specific people. But when you are the active go-to person, what does a well-being program in the corporate place look like?
It starts with data. I think a lot of well-being doesn't get traction because they don't pull the data. What problem are you trying to solve? There was an organization I worked for where we were focused on recruiting, retention, and then short-term disability leave. Noticed over time, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, like, it was record high at 2023. An employee taking short-term disability leave, just one, cost the company $500,000 a year. So you can imagine if you get one person. So there was no levers in between adversity and short-term disability leave. This was the first lever I pulled at the organization. I am experiencing some adversity. Boom, I'm on short-term disability leave. Now I got to figure it out. And I'm like, I think the organizations can do more, and they should do more, because I think the trust in other institutions are kind of wavering. So it's like, hey, organizations have a really good opportunity here to be that for people, right? So, like, the very first thing I started doing was basically a campaign to even identify or define what we mean when we say the term well-being, because we often interchange it. Wellness, well-being, mental health. If I walked into a company tomorrow, I would never use the term well-being, because I think it's lost its. People hear it and they're like, oh, I'm not even gonna, I know what this is. You're not going to trick me. You're just trying to squeeze more productivity, like whatever it is. There's a negative connotation, I think, especially in organizations where the ill-being is caused by the organization. Like, you're the one making me work or bringing me back into the office or doing X, Y, Z. Now you're telling me here's a stress reduction, program or whatever. So I think, define what we mean when we say the term well-being. I think a rose by any other name smells just as sweet. It could be performance. It could be human-centered development. But what we mean when we say well-being, wellness, I'll start with wellness first. Wellness has been done since the 90s. The Jack Welch rack and stack 80s CEO of GE used to rack and stack. I know you know this, but there's probably a lot of people who don't know the Jack Welch era, where it was, hey, there was not a lot of jobs, a lot of people, we racked and stacked, we cut the bottom 10%, right? Nowadays, that's not the case. With the 90s boom, we had to do more for employees, right? Because there was a shortage. There's been a shortage since the 90s. Look at any organization. There's hundreds, maybe even tens of thousands of jobs open at any given time. We have a talent shortage. So it's like, hey, now what do? We have to provide leadership development. This is where it started like ramping up. We started doing wellness. But I think what 2020 showed us is like we need to merge leadership development and wellness together. And then I think it will look more like well-being, right? So wellness is your sleep, nutrition, physical activity, your flu shots, stuff like that. Like, hey, we're going to give you some FSA money to go buy a Breathe Right strip, whatever. And then now there's well-being, right? Well-being, I say, is the neck up stuff. I think the good definition is the acronym PERMA, where it's positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And you can see just by those alone, you can get that all in the workplace. You get achievement. You definitely get meaning. Hopefully that's the goal anyway. You have relationships in the workplace. You experience positive emotions. You walk into your boss, they're standing on their phone, looking at it while you're talking to them, and they're just nodding their head. Like, you're not leaving that interaction feeling very positive, Put the phone down, make eye contact, be there, be present. Like, you're going to leave there pretty charged up, right? It's easy stuff like that. And this is what we talk about when we say like the culture. But I think that merging leadership development to all aspects of the corporation. So onboarding, recruiting, retention, the learning and development, like there's always opportunity. Even if you're trying to do skills development, you can bake in some of the well-being stuff and then have a standalone. Well, I'm not saying quit on well-being, like have a standalone program, bring in external consultants, professionals to like do custom training, like all that stuff I think matters. But the problem is we tend to give these 1 hour blocks and think we're going to make an impact, but it has to be a strategy. It has to be long-term programming in order to make an impact.
Yeah, I think to your point of building trust, right? When somebody's there, the consistent face of it, there are some clients I have that I've had for 10 years and I see them multiple times a month. So I am like part of the family. I'm kind of an in-house person without being in-house, but we've built that trust. They build that trust with me and familiarity. So when you have an in-house person, I would imagine for you, a lot of it is establishing that trust. Like, there are a lot of walls put up in the workplace for a lot of reasons, right? Where people don't want to share, don't want to come to somebody with their issues or their problems or whatever it is. And yet that's the only way we can really get into the head part, right? Is if there is that level of vulnerability, which only comes from trust. So you've done this in a number, like I know you did this at the law firm, and I've had experiences with the law profession as well. And you're right. Like, when the profession itself is the thing that's causing the issues.
Yeah.
And yet everybody is still capable and agency, right? They have agency over their own stuff. So I think sometimes we put, I don't know, maybe too much of the blame on the organization when there is still personal responsibility at play. So how do you balance those two things? How do you go about changing culture within the organization and also getting people to understand that, you're still in charge of you and you still get to decide if you take a break and go for a walk or if you don't?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the individual. I think this is a challenge with well-being, building strategy for a corporation of 170,000, 4,000, whatever it is. It's like, I'm going to grab the data and then take my best shot. I think everyone needs stress reduction, right? We're going to do, how do you manage stress? Not stress reduction. I shouldn't say that. How do you manage stress? Because a life without stress is probably not a good life at all. Stress is useful, but then it's like, hey, it doesn't resonate with everybody. Like, hey, I don't like, the number one thing I learned when I rolled out a program one time was resilience. People tend to rate themselves higher in resilience than they actually are. It's one of those phenomenons where if they were to take a survey or something, they would rate themselves higher than they actually are. Whereas self-discipline, they always rate themselves lower than they actually are. They're like, I'm a Harvard lawyer. I work at a law firm. I'm on a diet, but I ate a piece of chocolate cake. Therefore, I have no self-discipline. It's like, no, like you're probably a pretty disciplined person to get to where you are. I rolled out this program about resiliency and it was like crickets, like nobody showed up. And I was like, wait a second, like, why is this happening? And it was like, all leaders want their workforce to be resilient, but every individual thinks they're resilient. So they're like, I'm not clicking into that. Like, so you gotta market it. You gotta like trick people into like, hey, come to this, whatever it is, like call it something different. But like, we're going to talk about, hey, have you ever had a thinking trap where, and then it's like, oh yeah, like thinking traps, definitely seen that one. And it's like, how do you get them in the door? And I think like when we were like rolling out programming, it was a lot. I learned a lot. And this was like the other thing too, was like during COVID is not the time to teach resiliency. It's like when times are steady state, that's when you build resiliency. So then when the adversity comes, you're like, good to go. Like, I remember everything you told me a year ago in the adversity now. So it's like they went heavy during COVID, but then immediately after, like, I feel like organizations started pulling back. It was like, no, this is the time we need to double down because of the next thing. Like, what's the next thing? Because you don't want to be caught off guard. We could stay ahead of it.
Well, and I think that's a great point that happens just in life in general. When things are good, people are like, oh, things are good. I don't have to do anything. I learned a long time ago, I was like, oh no, when things are good, that is when you bank. Like you bank because things are going to not be good at some point again. And yet we fall into that trap, right? Like when things are good, they're always going to be good. And so I can just coast. And then when things are bad, it does get into that head like, oh my gosh, things are always going to be bad. I'm never going to get out of this. Yeah. And it is that kind of loop that you can get sucked into really, really quickly. So I totally agree with kind of doubling down when things are good. And I would say whether this is within an organization or even just somebody, your family, because your family is your organization, or your community or your friend circle, or you personally, be thinking of what you can do, right? Yes, adversity is going to come. That is actually called life.
Right.
Life is a series of challenges. It's what you're going to get to do in the face of those challenges. And you're only going to be able to face them if you have developed your skills, your resiliency, your grit, your determination, change your attitude, your mindset, your outlook, all of those things. Those things don't happen in the midst of the challenge generally, right? They happen maybe because you reflected on it and you're thinking about, oh, I did develop that skill or that perspective or whatever. So I even think, after coming through adversity, it's so important to do like real intentional reflection about it. And yet I think we're conditioned to just like move on, just move forward, let go, right? And I think that does us a disservice because we're just missing that opportunity to solidify that we do have these new skills and tools that are going to be useful in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. We have this concept in the military called AAR, after actions review. So every time you do a exercise, a mission, you'll go back and you'll say like, hey, what was supposed to happen, what actually happened, and how could we get better? I remember Microsoft used start, stop, and keep doing after an event or a project. They were just really big on feedback, implementing it at the time of when it was necessary. So after completion of a project and things like that. And it's like, I think when you implement, and all that stuff helps with well-being. Like that's why I think there's a lot of overlap between leadership development, some HR functions and well-being. Like building self-efficacy, how do you do it? You set goals. Like this is all part of the review process. How do you do a review process? If you're talking to your people once a year, like that's probably not going to cut it, especially different generations require different touch points. Some people need to be heard from more. And like all of that stuff helps with well-being. It helps build the self-efficacy like we talked about. Hey, you set goal XYZ. How did you do? What steps did you take to achieve it? Things like that. It's like all of that stuff is what contributes to our well-being. We all want to do good things. We all want to achieve goals. We want to set, and the bigger the goal, like the better that feels. Like you ever done like something really hard? It's not like you're feeling great while you're doing it. Anything worthwhile is going to be tough, challenging. You're going to go through a lot of adversity. But at the end of the day, the accomplishment is what you can hang your hat on. So it's worth it.
Yeah. And I think that's another challenge in modern society that we face because we do have some things that literally give you something in an instant for basically no effort. And then you start to expect that that's how everything should be. And if I don't get some kind of instant outcome, well, then it doesn't work or why bother? And then we just give up. And then, like you said, we have such easy access to everything. That's actually part of the problem, right? These days. We don't really have to work hard for very much, right? We don't have to go hunt and gather food. And I'm in a nice warm house, even though it's super cold and yucky outside. And life is comfortable for even in the worst case scenarios, life is still relatively comfortable. But yeah, I mean, anything, if you didn't have anything invested in it, you're not going to really have any kind of appreciation for it. And anytime you do have some kind of sacrifice, you probably value that thing a lot more than if it was just handed to you.
Yeah.
So I think we can even just bring this into the individual and where we are in January. Probably, when we publish this, it'll be roughly third week of January. People's resolutions have probably already been put on the shelf by now. So I don't know. I think anybody can take this from an individual perspective, because I'm always going to look at the ground up, and the ground starts with the individual. The better and healthier and more resilient the person is, the better everything around them is going to be, and the better impact they're going to have on everyone and everything around it, which then is like that trickle up effect. So as you're talking to individuals, because I imagine you do a lot of that as well, right? Especially even in your leadership role in the military. When you see somebody who's kind of hitting that wall or feeling like they're giving up or feeling like, whatever they're doing isn't working, what are the steps that you give them to kind of guide them through that?
I think this is a great question. And I want to go back to the very first positive psychology book I ever read, which kind of got me into it, which was The Happiness Advantage. And it was all about, we are ingrained to shoot for the next thing. First grade, congratulations, you graduated first grade, or, it's second grade, third grade, you got into a good college, you got a good job, promotion. It's the next thing, right? Everyone's like, the next thing, that's all I need. I'm an associate in a law firm. I just need to make partner and then I'll be happy. Okay, associate, have you ever talked to a partner in a law firm? Are they happy? They're no more happy than you are as an associate. It's so we just keep hanging our hat and just hey, it's the lake house. It's the Lamborghini. If I just get these things, I'm going to be happy. And it's that's a recipe for disaster. It's the hedonic treadmill, right? You're never going to get there. And the idea is you got to love and enjoy the journey, take care of that. The byproduct of thriving is those things. If you're crushing it, you're doing all the right things, you're setting goals, achieving them, building self-efficacy, having positive emotions at work, having deep meaning and connection in what you do. All of that, if you have all of that and you're firing all cylinders, the byproduct, you won't be denied. The byproduct will be the promotions and the bonuses and whatever it is that, you may want or think you want, right? So I think this is the maturation process for a lot of people. And I think when you get into your 40s and 50s, it's a lot different. And people are like, well, I wouldn't put up with that. It's no, you would, because you did when you were 20, because you were grinding to get to where you are today. So it's okay, I think, to sacrifice things and grind early on, just to know that, hey, things get better later in life. You can say no a little more comfortably when you're, a little bit older, because you don't have to worry about when your next paycheck is coming in and if you have enough money to keep the lights on, things like that. So I think part of the grind, early on, 20s, 30s, I get it. 40s, you could probably pull back a little bit, but not, because you're a little bit smarter. You just know what you can say yes and no to, things like that. I think if we put our well-being up, make it a priority, I think that all those other things that you want come true. I had this idea coming into the new year where I was going to try something new and different for 30 days, because we habituate too. There's positive interventions. If I tell you, hey, the number one positive intervention is acts of kindness and the gratitude journal, 3 good things. You're going to write 3 good things. You're going to do it every night. You're 30 days in, you're going to be like, okay, are you still getting the impact to your well-being 30, 60, a year later? Or did you habituate to it? So it's you always gotta, just like progressive overloading in the gym, trying, getting better, getting faster, getting stronger, lifting more weight. You got to do that with your well-being too. You could jump in an ice tub, but after a while you're going to be like, okay, I'm 5 minutes at 32 degrees. Where do I go from here? You got to do something different, So maybe cut that routine out, try something different, go back to that, bring it in. So for this year, I was going to write down 12 things to do, 1 per month. and then just stick with it for 30 days. Right. And I think like that's a pretty good way to do it because you're staying ahead of habituation. You're mixing things up all the time. You're always going to have a new challenge, whatever it is. Some things are easy, like red light therapy is one of them where you just sit under a red light. But to build that habit that's the challenge, right? It's like to get the consistency because that's what well-being requires. Like you got to be consistent.
So I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your January thing to do?
Red light.
Oh,
yeah. I kind of threw that one out there.
Excellent. Well, Adam, I feel like we could talk forever. Unfortunately, we don't have forever. So anything that we've missed that you feel is important for the audience to know?
I think when it comes to individual well-being, it's like, what do you enjoy? Because like we talk about things like running and things like that. And other people are like, oh, I feel that way when I hear people talk about meditation. I'm like, I can't do it. It's just not for me. Right. So it doesn't just try a thing. Right. There's a laundry list of positive psychology interventions, but just grab one and just try it. Just because it worked for your friend or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that's what you have to do. It looks very different for everybody.
Excellent advice. I am going to encourage everybody to follow you on LinkedIn because you put great content. You always have something of value that's posted, comes up in my feed all the time. So I always get a daily dose of Adam's wisdom. All your info will be in the show notes. And yeah, this was a great conversation. Great way to wrap up January. Thank you for showing up on the show today. And
thank you.
Listeners, now you get to go and be a better being.
Thank you for listening to the Be a Better Being podcast. We hope that what you heard today inspires you to embrace this journey of life with an open mind, a kind heart, and a willingness to learn and evolve. If you have a show topic idea or would like to be a guest, please visit betterbeings.net and fill out a contact form. Until next time, go and be a better being.